Hello, hello. Everybody, take your seats. Get comfy. Hi. All right. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Explorers Club. My name is Mariah Wilson. I am a documentary filmmaker with a focus on wildlife conservation who is a fellow here at the club, and I'm very excited for tonight. Now, we usually start these lectures out with an informal survey. How many of you have been here before? Okay. And how many of you, is it your first time here? Nice. Excellent, excellent. Well, for those who have been here before, welcome back. For those who are in the Explorers Club for the first time, welcome, welcome. This is a very special place where you can have conversations with, frankly, all sorts of fascinating people. I've had evenings here where I've had a talk with a marine biologist, a volcanologist, a gourmet chef entomologist, a wildlife veterinarian, a glaciologist, and an astronomer, all in basically like 1 hour. Now, a bit of history. The Explorers Club was founded in 1904. On the way in, you probably saw the placard downstairs that was listing the famous firsts of the club. First to the North Pole, first to the South Pole, first to summit Everest, first to step on the moon, and first to the bottom of the Marianas Trench. Fun fact, there's a strip on the bottom of the placard that is empty, and it's being reserved for the first person to go to Mars, which we all believe will also be an Explorers Club member. Today, the club includes 3,800 members engaged in science, field research, and resource conservation for the benefit of humanity and our planet, and beyond our planet, too. Public lectures are an important tradition here at the club dating back to the 1920s. It's a way for explorers to share their research and discoveries with their peers, and the general public. Some of the people who have stood at this podium include Neil Armstrong, Jane Goodall, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Sylvia Earle, her deepness. Since the Explorers Club was founded, the way that exploration is defined, approached, and achieved has changed a lot. And who is considered to be an explorer has evolved as well. The Explorers Club of today takes more care to acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge and stewardship of wild places around the globe. Which brings us to our lecture tonight. Into the Tides of Memory, where Dr. Paige West will be teaching us more about the intersection between reef conservation and Indigenous knowledge in the Pacific. This talk will go deep, no pun intended, on a long-term expedition into the living seascapes of New Ireland, Papua New Guinea, where Indigenous science and ancestral law guide marine stewardship. Along the way, we will encounter stonefish traps, sacred reefs, and communities rebuilding ecological resilience by reweaving culture, kinship, and conservation, offering a radically different vision of what exploration and discovery can mean in the 21st century. A bit more about tonight's lecturer. Dr. Paige West is a Claire Tow Professor of Anthropology at Barnard College and Columbia University, a Guggenheim Fellow, and she is a longtime Explorers Club member and part of the EC50 class of 2021. For nearly 3 decades, Dr. West has worked closely with Indigenous communities in Papua New Guinea. Her research examines how people understand and live with the natural world. In long-term partnership with Indigenous colleagues, she focuses on sustaining biodiversity-linked traditions and also understanding how communities facing climate change can imagine the future, relocate when necessary, and rebuild meaningful lives in new places. Dr. West is the author of 3 books, editor of 5 others, and founder of the journal Environment and Society Advances in Research. Beyond academia, she co-founded the Papua New Guinea Institute of Biological Research and the Roviana Solwara School, supporting locally led science and education that bridges Indigenous knowledge and Western approaches. And with that, it is my honor to bring up tonight's speaker, Dr. Paige West, to the podium.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. I've been a member of the Explorers Club for a while. Really honored to be in this room giving a talk where so many incredible people have not only given talks, but been in the audiences. So as somebody who's worked on Indigenous land with Indigenous communities for such a long time, and really that's just been the blessing of my life, I'm also a person like all of you who spend a lot of time on Indigenous land here in New York City. We are right now on Lenape land, and so I want us to just take a moment together to think about the Lenape and the land that they held for a very long time before the colonial period, throughout the colonial period, and today. And I want to honor the Lenape's elders today, ones in the past, and the ones that are emerging right now. The part of the world that we're talking about today is Oceania. And Oceania seems like a big spot on the ocean with lots of little tiny islands. But if we slightly shift our thinking, it's actually one of the largest regions in the world. So if you think about the island nations that make up Oceania, and you think about their exclusive economic zones, it's about 40 to 45 million hectares square. This makes this the largest, it's a continent. It's an aqueous continent. And you know, if we think with people like the great philosopher Apili Hoafa, who was from the region and talked about it as a sea of islands, we start to move away from thinking about these as far-flung islands that are separated by long distances that are hard to get between, and we start to think about it as an aqueous continent. And that's the way that Pacific Islanders who are scholars, academics, who are philosophers, think about the place in the world that they live, to kind of push back against the terms Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, even Oceania, and to think about it as the Moana, an aqueous continent. Today we're talking about the island of New Guinea. The island of New Guinea is the second largest island on Earth. It's about 785,000 kilometers square. For people that don't do kilometers, that's about 303,000 square miles. It's 3 times as big as the United Kingdom. It's larger than Texas. If we took it and we actually laid it flat on the east coast of the United States, it would stretch all the way from the tip of Florida to where we are right now. So it is a really big island. And you can see from this kind of bad map that through the spine of the island is a mountain range that is an incredibly high mountain range. So people have been living on this incredible island for a very long time. And when we think about the peopling of the island of New Guinea, we want to think about 2 migrations. The first migration is between 45 and 60,000 years ago. These are non-Austronesian languages that are migrating down from Southeast Asia. These are folks that are walking over land, walking down, because everything's connected back then. They're walking down through what is now New Guinea down to Australia. But along the way, people are kind of hiving off from that migration. And so you have folks living on New Guinea today whose ancestors came all that time ago. Then you have a second migration that's probably around 3,200 years ago. These folks are the kind of people we think about as the oceanic branch of Austronesian languages. These are Lapita people, for my archaeologists in the audience, and these folks are traveling in canoes. So when we think about those really incredible sailing canoes that we see all over Moana today, all through the Pacific Islands. These are folks that those are their ancestors. So they came on canoes, they went down from Taiwan to what is now the island of New Guinea, and they went throughout all of the Eastern Pacific. So you can see that these two migrations create the conditions of possibility for this. The island of New Guinea is the most linguistically diverse place on our planet. There are over 1,000 living languages on the island, and these are not dialects, these are 1,000 different languages. It is also one of the most ecologically diverse places on our planet. It contains one of the most extensive tropical forest systems on Earth. It's got the third largest continuous expanse of tropical rainforest on Earth. And it's just got this incredible system diversity that you can see from this map. You can go from the southeastern Papuan rainforest to the swamps. You can go up to these incredible Central Range mountains, which are high mountains forested. There are cloud forests, just an incredible system diversity there. It also has an incredible biological diversity. And these slides are pretty data heavy, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but just take a second while I find my water to look at the incredible terrestrial biodiversity. And one of the things you'll notice is that when you see these biodiversity slides from the island of New Guinea, you see a little squiggle in front of the number, and that means that those are estimates, because every single time a scientist goes to the island, they go on an expedition. And today, the cool thing, as you learned in the introduction for people that are new to the Explorers Club, the cool thing today when scientists go to New Guinea, it's not just scientists that look like me that are going there, it's scientists who are Papua New Guinean who are going on expeditions, and they're doing all of this research, and they're finding species that haven't been described by Western science yet. So this is the terrestrial biodiversity. It also is a place of extraordinary marine biodiversity. It's located in the global area we think of as the Coral Triangle, which is the most biologically diverse part of our ocean. It's also in the Western Pacific Warm Pool, which is the quickest warming part of our ocean, which we'll return to. So, this is a very text-heavy slide. I'm going to walk you through it. For me as an anthropologist, I'm an environmental anthropologist, so I was trained in both ecology and anthropology. As an anthropologist, it's incredibly important for me to understand these colonial histories so I can understand the social and ecological context of today. So if we think about the island of New Guinea, there were major political changes during the 19th and 20th centuries as European colonial powers divided and administered the region. The western half was controlled by the Netherlands, and they took control in about 1828, while the eastern half was split in half with the Germans in the north and the British in the south. You can then, I think I have a pointer here, I love a pointer. I lecture to students this semester. I have a very large lecture class at Columbia and Barnard, and I don't have a pointer, and I'm constantly with my thing pointing, and the students are like, no, that's not doing anything. Absolutely not, but here. Okay, so you can also see what happens with the western half stays a part of the Netherlands, the eastern half divided up, then it becomes part of Australia, it's administered by Australia, then you go through World War I and World War II, you have some other shifts, and then the most important shift to think about for today is that with the Act of Free Choice in 1969, which was neither free nor a choice for the Papuans who live in West Papua, but with the Act of Free Choice, Indonesia becomes the colonial power of West Papua, and it is still a colony of Indonesia today. It's a settler colony. And then the eastern half of the island becomes the independent state of Papua New Guinea, 1975. Independence. And so today we are talking about Papua New Guinea, the place that I've had the honor of working since 1997. So Papua New Guinea is a parliamentary democracy. It is a place with about 12 million people, 860 different languages just in Papua New Guinea. So the most linguistically diverse country on Earth. Most people in Papua New Guinea live in rural areas. About 80 to 85% of the population depends directly on forests, reefs, or other biodiversity to make their livelihoods. 97% of the land in the country is owned by the indigenous people, which is incredible. The gentleman you see in the picture, Sir Michael Somare, who was the first prime minister of the country, also someone who stayed in kind of political power in really incredibly productive ways for his entire life. He helped to enshrine that local ownership in the Constitution, but the caveat with that is that the nation state owns the subsurface mineral rights. So because of that, what else do I need to say before I flip? Parliamentary democracy. That's about it. Okay, so if we think about the trade exports, we see a connection back to what I just said. So this is a place that is really focused on resource extraction. Because those subsurface rights are owned by the state has really encouraged resource extraction. So we think about it as an export economy focused on extractive economies. There's an interesting category, other exports down there. And these are the exports that are sometimes really beneficial to local people. So if we think about wood and timber, that's not really beneficial to local people. Coffee, incredibly beneficial. People talk about coffee as the people's commodity. Also, fishing that is not tuna is in other exports. So this is kind of when people are not just hunting and fishing for their own food. This is how they're making money through these economies. So when I think about my work in Papua New Guinea over all these years, I think about a kind of primary interest in understanding the entangled relationships and entangled worlds between human beings and the other creatures that we share this planet with and the systems that we all inhabit together. And I sort of think about that through a kind of anthropological, theoretical lens of entangled worlds. I'm not going to bore you all with anthropological theory tonight. And I also think about it in terms of biocultural sovereignty. You know, as I'll mention in a couple of minutes, I've worked on conservation for a very long time and in conservation for a very long time. On conservation means that I've thought very carefully and critically about what works and doesn't work. In conservation means that I've been trying to think about how to do it better if I'm going to be critical of it. And biocultural sovereignty is basically the concept that indigenous people have had relationships with their surroundings, with the biodiversity on their lands and in their waters for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and they are very good stewards of those places. If we really want those places to be robust systems, then indigenous people need to have sovereignty over those places. So the other thing that has really been an incredibly important part of my work is working with people, working with communities, and collaborating. And again, just to shout out to the Explorers Club, there are so many people in this EC50 group that are really focused on collaboration. It's one of the most kind of capacious collaboratory groups I have ever been a part of. So, quickly, how did I get from all those years ago till today? So, in 1997, I was a PhD student at Rutgers University. I knew that I had a compelling research question, which is, what's the relationship between external ways of understanding biological diversity and cultural diversity and local ways of understanding biological diversity and cultural diversity? What's the difference between those two systems of understanding? How do those two different systems of understanding produce knowledge about the world? What do they take as axiomatic? What do they take as needing more kind of data for? And then how do those systems come together in partnership? How do they come together in conflict? And so I went to a place called the Crater Mountain Wildlife Management Area, which at the time in the late 1990s was one of the largest protected areas in New Guinea. And I asked those questions. You know, in asking those questions, I thought a lot about who had started the conservation area. It was started by people at the Bronx Zoo, Wildlife Conservation Society. And one of the things I found was that the global conditions that structured environmental conservation in the 1990s made it so that well-meaning people at the Bronx Zoo had certain timelines that they had to match for their donors. They had certain kinds of conservation they could get money for and certain kinds of things they couldn't get money for. And so they were really driven by this external agenda. And that external agenda got laid down on the top of the Gimi-speaking world. That's one of the languages I work in, Unavisa Gimi. That got laid down on top of the Gimi-speaking world, and it was a fundamental mismatch with Gimi world views and Gimi ideas. So I wrote, my pointer again? Wait, no. I got too excited about the pointer, sorry. Okay, I wrote that book. That's my dissertation turned into a book. I came back to the United States, and because I'm married to a saint who's in this audience right now, I was able to write my dissertation pretty quickly and to get a really fancy job at Columbia University and Barnard College. And while, I was working on my first book, I was also going back to Papua New Guinea. I ended up publishing that first book, Conservation is Our Government Now. Lots of the people that I had gotten to know in Papua New Guinea, young Papua New Guinean researchers, read it. They're like, yep, that's right. It's a searing critique of environmental conservation as exported from North America to Papua New Guinea. Yep, we agree with all of it. You got a really good job. What are you going to do for us? And so early in my career, I had the privilege of having people that I loved and respected from the place that I work saying, you need to step back and think about how you're going to help. We can see that you're going to have a great career. We can see that you're going to do what academics do everywhere, publish books, give lectures, do all that jazz, but how are you going to help? And so, together, we founded a thing called the Papua New Guinea Institute of Biological Research. This is a small NGO that was dedicated to creating the conditions of possibility for Papua New Guineans to move into research roles in their own country and to really work as people trained at the nexus of indigenous knowledge and Western science to push conservation to actually listen to indigenous people. I also was lucky enough early in my career to have these three women as my first PhD students who in the late Now, if you were one of my undergraduates, I would tell you, you have to answer that and you have to put your mom on speakerphone. I was really lucky to have these three incredible women as my first three PhD students who, much like my Papua New Guinean colleagues, said to me, this is great, we're working with you, that's wonderful, but there's a whole literature emerging right now on decolonizing anthropology, and you need to read it and you need to learn it. And so I got pushed by these incredible people. One of the things that we did at PNG-IBR was we had a lot of students that worked on terrestrial systems, and we wanted to have sites for our students to work on marine systems. And so I was dispatched in 2007 to go and find a marine site. And I met this guy who is watching on the live stream from Papua New Guinea right now. Hello. This is, yay! So John is also a member of the Explorers Club 50. So I met Chief John Iney. And so, I said that I had had with my PhD that kind of critique of external conservation. John was a marine scientist who had the exact same critique as me, but from a very different perspective. He and his brother Miller and their cousin brother Michael had founded an NGO called Islands Awareness in 1993. They had seen this incredible mismatch between external conservation organizations and what they wanted to do in rural Papua New Guinea, where they live in New Ireland, that I'll tell you about in a minute. They had seen a mismatch between what outsiders wanted to do and what locals wanted outsiders to do. And so they founded this NGO with the idea that they could translate between the two. And so John and I met, I have to look at my time. John and I met in a parking lot. I was kind of walking around trying to find folks to talk to about maybe having students there, and he was outside of the Wildlife Conservation Society offices. His NGO had a little office right next door to them, and he was sitting in a parking lot smoking cigarettes, chewing betel nut, no shirt on, heat of the day, talking to people. And I was with a Western ecologist, very, very well-trained person, who said to me, look at that. That's the reason Papua New Guineans shouldn't be in charge of conservation in their country. And I perked up. I was like, oh, well, this is going to be fun. And so I went over and I talked to John. And, you know, you all are a great audience, and you know what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that what John was doing was talking to every single person who was bringing fish into the wharf that was down the street. He was talking to every single person who was taking a sick child to the hospital. He was talking to every single person who was coming in from an outer island, from a village on an outer island, with catch that they were going to go sell at the market. He was doing this incredible research that was looking at biological diversity and local needs and local practices. And so John and I got to talking, and we started thinking about our shared critique of external conservation. We started thinking about the fact that we both had seen communities not listened to in external conservation. And where were we? We were in New Ireland, which is where John's from. He's from New Hanover Island, which the real name for is Lavengai. New Hanover is the colonial name. From Lavengai Island. New Ireland province is a marine province. It's not a huge area spatially, about 243,000 people. It's got the main two islands and then outlying islands. So when John and I met, we realized that we had both been asked repeatedly by conservation organizations that we were critiquing as individuals, well, can you do it any better? And in a moment of youthful hubris, we said, yeah, we actually think we might be able to do it better. And we were lucky enough for the Christensen Fund, which some of you may remember, Christensen Foundation. They gave us some money to spend a couple of years doing what we argued that external conservation had not done, just listening to people. And so we spent 2 years doing a massive ethnographic study, talking to about 2,000 people, 18 different languages, all over the island, asking them some kind of basic questions. What do you see changing around you biologically that you're worried about? And what do you see changing around you culturally that you're worried about? And so these are the distilled findings of that very large survey. I'm going to allow you to enjoy it while I take another drink of water. So the number one thing that people talked to us about was food security. They were incredibly worried about food security for a variety of reasons. They were worried about the loss of tradition and loss of traditional sociocultural practices. They were very, very critical of colonial history. They were critical of mission history and missionization and the way that had eroded tradition. They did that while being very good practicing Catholics. People are Catholic, they're Lutheran, they're Seventh-day Adventist, and they still have a really nuanced way of thinking about what their ancestors knew and how Christian missionaries transformed the ability to maintain that knowledge set. People were very worried about the declining respect for elders. They were worried about increasing logging for oil palm plantations. They were worried about external conservation efforts that weren't listening to them. We kind of knew they were going to be worried about that. And then they were worried about existing mining sites. There are several active mines in the region. The thing that they talked about, using not the term climate change, but all of these other things that we now class together to talk about climate change, they were worried about all of those and they were talking about them. And they weren't talking about them as climate change, but they were talking about all the things that we now know are the effects of climate change. And so John and I walked away from analyzing that data and we thought, whew, that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff to work on. Can we really do it any better? And we thought, well, the way to do it better is to think about what kinds of projects we can do that address some of these concerns together. So today we focus on things like local livelihoods and food security. And I'm going to do these quick, and then I'm going to give you an example of one way that we kind of pull all these things together. Local livelihoods and food security. We focus on helping folks to reweave traditions, to kind of unbraid or take apart the colonial history so that they understand what from the past they want to honor and revitalize. We focus on Indigenous socio-ecological sovereignty, and we do that through talking with people to understand how we can do things in the world that might have results that people in this room would think of as conservation results, but doing them in a way that is true to Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ontology and epistemology, so Indigenous philosophy and Indigenous knowledge building. We also focus on the effects of climate change. And we do all of this through an organization that has grown since we started working together, Islands Awareness. Islands Awareness is in a really cool partnership with Barnard College and Columbia University. Somebody asked me about that at the end. And so this is what we've been doing for the past 17 years. We've been trying to take those things and braid them together in projects. All of it has been kind of vetted by elders. Everything we do, we run past a council of elders that we have. So we have 7 different ongoing projects. I'm going to show you those 7 projects quickly, and then we're going to drill down a little bit into one fish trap project. So the first thing we have is the school that you heard about in the lovely introduction I got. We really wanted to think with people there about what it looks like, not to say, we're only going to focus on Indigenous knowledge. You scientists, get out of here, because John's trained as a scientist. I'm trained in part as a scientist. We wanted to say, what does it look like when you teach at the nexus of Indigenous knowledge and external knowledge? And what kinds of solutions can we find when those two knowledge forms are brought together? We also have a project that is focused on the revitalization of the Mai system, which is a system of chiefly status. John is a chief, and so he is particularly focused on this. We have another project that is, and I'm not going to get in the weeds about Maligan, but I know my New York City audiences and people like to talk about Maligan. We also have a project, elders came to us in 2010. They said that Maligan, which is a kind of set of rituals that carry someone all the way from when they're conceived, through birth, through life, to death, they were worried about parts of that eroding, and they were worried about passing on those traditions. So we have a Maligan project. We have a Women in Leadership project that was also brought to us by elders. You know, these are matrilineal societies in New Ireland, and yet when we think about the histories of colonization and missionization, there was a focus on men when outsiders came in, and women have felt like their role in society has been eroded, so we work with women to think through how to strengthen their roles in society. We have an incredible internship program, and we should also cheer again because I believe the interns are all watching. It's the middle of the night there. And you can ask me questions about it. We work with wonderful, wonderful young people from Papua New Guinea, everything from college students to high school students to people who want to shift careers. We also have a mapping project where we're thinking with Indigenous communities how to foster community-led mapping that can help them make sovereign claims when their land or their sea is under threat. And our real signature kind of program is Vala. So Vala is a word in the language that John grew up speaking, and it is a socio-spiritual practice where people draw on ritual knowledge, ancestral relations, and ecological knowledge to foster abundance and balance on the land and on the sea. It's both a way of caring for human, spiritual, and ecological relations, and a material practice that tells people what they can and can't do at certain times. So, what is that in some plainer language? Forever and ever, people had regulated systems. How many people have been to Hawaii and seen the big fish traps there, the fish ponds, and seen the whole ridge to reef ecological system they have? Or been to, say, French Polynesia and seen Rahui? All over the Pacific, prior to colonialism, you had these massive systems of ecological balance that were put in place by Indigenous leaders, Indigenous architects, Indigenous master legal masters, where people work to understand seasonality, understand the way in which species reproduce and the kinds of systems that species that are valuable to them need, to understand the relationship between things happening in the high mountains and things happening on the reef, and then to think about the temporal rhythms of indigenous communities and the temporal rhythms of the ancestors. And people pulled all of this together into these incredible systems of environmental management. And so one of the biggest things that we've done is to work with folks to revitalize this in New Ireland. This is something that most people did not know and did not do anymore, and we've been working with communities around the whole entire region to revitalize these systems. We have a methodology for doing it that you can't see my slide, it's a bad slide, but basically, folks come to us, they talk about a problem that they see in their community, we go out, we say, well, here's some of the stuff we've done in the past, this is what Islands Awareness can do. You all sit with that for a minute, then come back to us if you want us to help you figure out what's going on in your community, what's causing the problem. If they say they want our help, we go out with interns, we go out with researchers, everything from ecologists to biologists to hydrologists to engineers, and we try to figure out what's causing the problem that Indigenous folks have identified. We also work with anthropologists and others to interview people there about the reasons they think the problem is happening. Then we go back to them, we say, this is what the data says. Let's make a plan, if you want to try and stop this from happening in your community. Our specific example today is from Lavangai, which is where John is from. This is New Hanover Island when we think about the colonial names of things. This is a large island. You can see from the screen, it sort of mirrors the things we've already talked about, a long history of migration, incredible marine biodiversity, incredible terrestrial diversity. I'm getting nervous about time, sorry. It is also a place that is ravaged by the suite of things that we now know to be caused by climate change. So the marine and terrestrial systems on New Hanover and around New Hanover face significant climate change threats due to the things that you see on the screen. Rising sea surface temperatures, increasing atmospheric CO2, sea level rise, stronger and more frequent tropical storms, changes in ocean circulation and temperature. And all of these things have already been happening there. So there's this way in which, and this audience already knows this from the amazing ocean weeks that we do here at the Explorers Club, but people talk about climate change coming. Climate change has been on Lavangai for a real long time, and people are struggling to figure out how to live with it. So in 2012, elders came to us from Lavangai, and these are people that John's related to. Remember, he's from there. And they said, okay, so we see a couple of problems, and we're really worried about them. We've been worried about them in the past, but we're incredibly worried about them now. We're worried about declining reef fish, and we're worried about coastal erosion. And they wanted to know kind of what's causing this. And people had their own ideas about it. We had our own ideas. John and the team went out, did some research to try and ask what's causing the decline in reef fish, and what's causing the erosion. So for the fish, local overharvest, and then people from off-island coming and harvesting. If you had time to look at that marine biodiversity slide, the water around Lavangai is particularly biologically diverse. It's also important for big pelagics, and so you have a lot of water that's upwelling with nutrients right off the coast, so lots of big fish out there. They use the area around Lavangai for spawning, so it's just incredibly rich for fishing. You have local people overfishing. You have also people from other islands coming and fishing when they shouldn't be. Coastal erosion, storm surges, thermal expansion, those are the two biggest causes. A key piece of what happened once we delivered that information back to communities, or once John and the team did, was that people said, there's a conservation organization that's been working here, and they're doing a marine protected area. That's great. We don't really have anything to do with that. We want to do something ourselves. And they remembered that there had been these fish traps that when they were young people they saw. So the elders said, you know, our grandparents used to do this thing, and let's think about that a little bit. And so John and I decided to think with them about those fish traps. Many of you will be familiar with traditional tidal fish traps. You found them historically all across the region. As I mentioned, if we think about Polynesia, you see them on French Polynesia, you see them in French Polynesia today, you see them in Hawaii today. They would have been in all of these places. So what did we do? This lovely woman is Dorothy Billings. She is an anthropologist who worked out on Lavangai Island in the 1960s, and she was an incredible data collector. She spoke the local language. She talked to everybody about everything. She was nosy in a way that I could never. I'm not a good anthropologist in that way. Dorothy just talked to everybody about everything. She saw somebody doing something and was like, hey, why are you doing that? And she took notes about it. And so I am a good anthropologist in that I do take notes, but she really, for years and years and years, wrote down everything she could learn, especially from old people. And think about this. She's working there in the 1960s, and she's working with people who are in their 70s and 80s. So she's getting this incredible knowledge. So when we started working with people to revitalize these fish traps, we called up Dottie, and we said, hey, you know, do you have anything in your notes about, and she interrupted us and said, I'll just send them to you. And so she shared with us everything that she had found about these fish traps when she was doing her research. So, I'm gonna have to pull this over here, I can't. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, so, we split things up because there's some stuff that's not appropriate for me to do and some stuff that is. This project, after Michael Laddie and John Iney and I rang up Dorothy on the cell phone from Caslock Village, the next thing I did was work with students here in the United States and students in Papua New Guinea to go through the mission archives, the German colonial archives, the Otto Finch collection at the American Museum of Natural History, all of the scholarly literature we... Okay. Sorry, people that are streaming. Sorry, Mom. Okay, am I on? Okay, so I'm going to back up for a second for people on the stream. So I and students worked mission archive, colonial German archives, Otto Finch collection. We talked to the last living colonial Kiaps, who were the colonial patrol officers. We looked at all the scholarly literature we could get our hands on, and John and I talked to colleagues all over the world. The Islands Awareness staff went out and interviewed elders not just on Lavangai, but in lots of other places. Then John and I developed a PowerPoint. We sort of did what we do, took all that data, distilled it down, gave it to the folks who had asked us to work with them on this, and John and Michael presented it. And what they decided was to revitalize Ngoto, which are the traditional fish traps. I'm going to mess this up, sorry, because I'm going to move back over here. I'm going to put you in charge of that microphone. So we decided to revitalize Ngoto, which are the traditional fish traps. So how do fish traps work? They are ingenious. You have rising and falling tide, high tide, fish swim over the low stone walls into the reef flat or into the lagoon that you've created by making these stone walls. Water recedes, and you have fish trapped in there. The important thing about fish traps is they're not just about the fish. They're also about understanding the tidal patterns. They're about understanding how to do complex marine architecture. They're about understanding what species are going to be moving around at what time of year. They're about understanding what the tides are, when there's going to be a king tide, when there's going to be really low tides. They're also about understanding certain plant species that allow you to fish with plant species. ask me a question about that. To fish with certain plant species, because there are certain plants that are associated with certain fish. They also allow you to think about temporalities of communities, what kinds of things communities need at certain times, and then to work with ritual experts to open and close those fish traps, because the fish traps become vala areas. And so the fish traps, the big stone walls, which are the ngoto, then the trap inside the water is a polar. That is also a vala site, where a ritual expert has placed a prohibition. And that prohibition can only be opened and closed based on community negotiation. If you break that prohibition as a fisher from either that community or somewhere else, there are both legal and spiritual ramifications. And ritual experts can be addressed by the community if there's a death in the community, or if school fees are due, or if there's a field trip that the kids want to go on and you need to sell fish because you need to get something for your kid. The ngoto can be reopened when people need to use those areas. So there are these incredibly complex ways of organizing the relationship between marine biodiversity and cultural needs. So we worked with these folks to revitalize these fish traps. We're pretty sure that nobody had built one in 80 years. And as I said, these are spaces that have been agreed upon through Indigenous legal arrangements. So they've helped to increase the attention to Indigenous legal practices. As I said, that they're worked on by marine architects. So it's worked to revitalize local interest in architecture. And all of these things to build the fish trap have helped to rebraid all of these different knowledges. There are currently now 3 ngoto on Lavangai. And what people have reported to us is this, that they've actually seen an increase in the fish biomass in their diets. They've seen an increase in the diversity of fish. They've seen an increase in people's attention to the life cycles of fish and young people wanting to learn more about the fish. And all of the communities also note that these things are slowing coastal erosion. They're creating space for water to go during storms and king tides. There's a king tide there right now, actually. And they're lessening the effects of climate change and coastal-related events. Obviously, they're not solving the problem of climate change, but what they're doing is allowing people to live better right now. And then in June 2025, we met with elders from 5 additional communities who wanted to think with us about how to revitalize these fish traps in their area. So when we think about our work, we don't really think about it as research anymore. We think about it as kinship. We really follow Bernard Narakobi, who wrote The Melanesian Way, who was a Papua New Guinean philosopher. And he talked about the way in which personhood emerges through networks of reciprocity and mutual recognition, rather through bounded individualism. Folks that are listening elsewhere and that are in the audience know that the brilliant Marilyn Strathern, an anthropologist, has also written about this. But we really think about our work as being connected to building family. So John and I think of each other as siblings now. And we do this because we were recruited by others into thinking about ourselves that way. I was always one of those people who was like, oh, look at that anthropologist who's calling, people that they work with in this place their brother and their sister. And now I understand it's because everybody sees you as a brother and a sister, and so you just become. And so we have become family. I am the auntie to John's children. I am the auntie to every intern that works at Islands Awareness. John is the uncle to people in my life, my biological family. My mother calls him son. But more than that, I know, hi, Mom. More than that, the communities that we work with become family. And to circle back to one of our initial critiques of external conservation, external conservation is driven by project timelines that do not emerge from communities. And communities often have timelines for what they want and need that are the timeline of a lifetime. And so we think about these folks as family. We live with them, we eat with them, we mourn with them, we go to funerals, we go to births. We do what we can to be part of their family. We also like to think about our work as pushing the bounds of ethical collaboration. We think of it through the metaphor of weaving, and we think about, this is an analytic that is drawn from the practices of people in Melanesia who weave fine mats, who weave baskets, who weave beautiful bilum bags, who pull together strands from everywhere to create something that we hope is beautiful. And again, we always return to the question, so I have to stop my little alarm. We always return to the question of biological sovereignty. How do we create the conditions of possibility for young people like this to actually have a place that is extraordinary to live when they grow up, and a place where they can be in charge of their biodiversity, and their cultural diversity futures. We've also learned over the years that these projects belong to communities. They come to us, we work with them, we become family with them, but in the end, they are their projects, they're not our projects. For many years, the elders had a moratorium on us writing anything about this work. They only lifted that in about 2021, so we've started to publish. This is a place that's been really over-researched by outsiders, and people are just sick of it. They're just sick of people coming in, extracting data, and then going away. And they kind of said, let's do this work together, and you all just keep quiet for a while. We've learned to accept refusal when folks want us to, when they hear about the work we're doing, and they say, let's monitor these Nagoto, let's monitor this, let's monitor that. We talk to the elders, and the elders say, nope, we're not going to do that. John and I have to say, okay, that's fine. We can turn that grant down. We can say no thanks to people. And then for me, I've had to let go of the anthropological impulse to know. You know, I sort of joked about Dottie Billings being nosier than me, but there is a way in which anthropology is a field that, even for all the decolonization, even for all of the kind of amazing stuff people do, there's still a way that it wants to know everything that's going on. And I have to sit with the fact that people will just tell me, nope, go away. This is not for you. And I have to be cool with that. So there are times when it's really appropriate for me, as a person in my subject position, with my incredible privilege of teaching where I teach and having the resources that I have, to go to Papua New Guinea every single year for 3 or 4 months. There's a time for me to be present. There's a time for me to be absent. And one of the things that I always like to end with is talk about our incredible funders. We have been so lucky with our funding over the years to find people who are willing to take a bet on John and I saying, maybe we can do it better than you people. And then, because the elders have authorized, and that's us at the Met a couple of years ago, almost 10 years ago, wow. Because people have authorized us now to write about this work, we do have a large number of publications out. You can find them on my website, or you can just Google them on Google Scholar. And I just want to thank you all so much for being here in community together at the club. And then folks that are watching online, thank you so much. I think we now have time for questions. I'm going to get my friend to give me the microphone.
Thank you for the amazing talk. So I have a question. So one of the concerns the elders brought to you and John was the fish harvesting. I wonder on your thoughts on how this fish traps or any other methods could ultimately tackle that problem.
Fish overharvesting?
Yes. Yes.
Well, because there are prohibitions now that are actively discussed prohibitions. There are rules that people have to follow now that are put in place by ritual experts and by elders and by the kind of marine law experts. There are also spiritual prohibitions that if you break, the spirit world will invite you to think about not breaking them again. We have lots and lots of, I as an anthropologist would maybe call it data. Other people would call it examples. We have lots of information about people who have broken those spiritual prohibitions. Yes, they've gotten in trouble with elders in the community, but they have gotten in trouble with the spirits. And so there's a real sense now that these rules should not be played with. I can't see any of you because of the light.
Hi. I loved how you used data to make your programs work, but I have questions. Like you talked about what the community was worried about, but did you also ask why were they worried about? Like, was it an economical reason? Was it education, healthcare? What was it? And did your program help in achieving those goals? Like, did they get more economic benefits and stuff like that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you very much. I didn't go into the real survey design because that's slightly boring for an academic or for a non-academic talk. But you know, what we were focused on were questions around change and looking at local ontology and epistemology in addition to defining the sorts of changes that we as scientists, remember John's a fisheries management expert, I'm an anthropologist, the kinds of changes that we felt like we had external explanations for. And so we talked to people about what they thought, the things they thought were causing the changes they were seeing, and then we made some assessment about the things that we thought were causing the changes that they were seeing. There was a lot of discussion of health. It wasn't the major thing that people talked about. People talked about health, though, when they talked about fish and having enough fish to eat. They talked about health when they talked about the tailings from mines. They talked about health when they talked about the runoff from oil palm plantations. People are always talking about economic opportunity insofar as they're thinking about how are they going to feed their families. Because remember, this is a place where, you know, about 80 to 85% of the people that live there depend on these biological resources to feed their families and to actually be a part of the economy. So yes, we did talk to people about all those things. We do not have a health program. You know, there's a way in which, I was talking to my undergraduates this morning, and we're thinking we've just shifted into class, in my class on climate change, we've shifted into trying to not be so sad about it and really think about what are the solutions. And so today we were talking about how you can't do everything, that you have to figure out what you're really good at and do that. And there's just some stuff that we couldn't address, and health is one of the things that's very hard given our expertise to address.
So the over-harvesting, was it because of increased population, loss of other sources of protein, or things were being sold, you know, to make money?
So overharvesting had to do with a lot of different factors. One thing was overharvesting by people from off-island, so folks that are not from Lavangai but who know there are a lot of really healthy fish stocks there. One of the things was that people from villages that were not the village we were working with initially, so Lavangai Island has a village called Lavangai Village, and we were working with folks from Lavangai initially, and so folks from other places were coming and harvesting their fish. People also do fish for markets. People sell, women in particular, have really robust businesses selling fish at the local market, selling fish to the Lahir mine, which is a big gold mine on a different island. And so that's probably the reason that you had an increase in some ways in harvest. In terms of population, you know, it's hard for me to think through population numbers because we don't have really good census numbers. The last proper census was in 2020, and so we don't have good census numbers right now. Population is growing, but I think the real pressures are the ones that I just discussed. And then also, you think about it, you have folks that, when you have young people and they haven't grown up with these kind of interwoven systems, they don't actually understand the kind of spawning needs of fish. And so they're harvesting the female when they shouldn't be harvesting the female, or the male when they shouldn't harvest the male. They're harvesting ones that are way too small, that have not, met their kind of reproductive capacity yet. And so I think there was also, or what we've seen is a shift in what people know about the species that they're harvesting. And so I think that that's shifted. Maybe it doesn't shift over harvest, but because people have more knowledge, they're harvesting in a way that allows the resource to bounce back.
Hi, thanks for a fascinating talk. Would you mention the success of the traps that you've made and this particular island? Has news of that spread to the other islands, or do you see people in other communities also going in the same direction and wanting to do the same things?
That's a great question. Thank you for it. So, we have, I wish John, if you're still watching on the live stream, I wish you could be here right now. We have so many people coming to Islands Awareness who see the success, not necessarily of the traps, but the success of Vala areas and some of the other programs. People want to do this in their communities. We are spread so thin that we cannot do anything else. Like, we are at capacity. But we got this wonderful money from a donor who wishes to remain anonymous to begin to think about what it means not to scale up. We push back on the idea of scaling up, but we think about scaling across. And so what we mean by that is that we want to teach people what Islands Awareness has done and what these communities have done, and teach these methodologies, and then have them go and see if they can do them too. And so, yes, people are very interested. John is run ragged at all times.
I'd like to ask the question you wanted us to ask about the plant species helping to fish. But I'd also like to know, you said earlier in the talk that coffee is a commodity for the people. I'd like to know why.
Oh my goodness. So I'm going to anthro-nerd out here. So my second book is about the coffee industry in Papua New Guinea. And so if you think about these resource extraction economies where there's so much money that is going out based on mining and logging and oil palm, and now it's late in the day, I've been teaching all day, what's the word I'm looking for? Liquefied natural gas. All of those things do bring huge amounts of capital into the country, but that capital really does stay with those resource extraction companies. And because people don't own the subsurface minerals or the rights to those minerals, they get a little bit of benefit if they're landowners right around, for example, a gold mine, but that money doesn't flow out. But something like coffee, that if you think about 97% of the land being owned by the indigenous people, everybody has a coffee plot. And so they grow coffee. There are lots of coffee cooperatives. There are lots of these incredible folks who are working there to pull coffee growers together to sell coffee at a premium price. It's the best coffee in the world. I'm not biased. This is scientific fact. It is the same. It's the same kind of genealogy of coffee that you have when you have Jamaica Blue Mountain coffee. It's Arabica. And so this is something that people get a premium price for. And it's something that people think of as a bank. So you have a coffee garden that is incredibly productive, and that's money on the trees. So that's what I mean. And I will not get in the weeds to your question, although it's one of the things that we've been the most excited about with all of this work. It's like almost every single day, John texts me and says something like, well, I was talking to this elder, and they said that actually there's a plant that they used to know about when they were young that is associated with this particular fish spawning time. And when the fish spawns, the plant becomes edible, things like that. So there's this way in which these systems, people knew in the case of New Ireland, but all over the world they know the relationship between everything in these massive chains of biological diversity, all up and down the aquatic terrestrial interface. And if we start to wrap our mind around what it means to have taken that apart, to have said, oh, these are marine resources, or oh, these are terrestrial resources, the way that I did, because it's the language we use. But actually, these are resources that people know how they're tied together seasonally.
Hey, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question about the fish traps. In an earlier answer, you mentioned the main cause of overfishing was from people outside the community. It seems like the solution is really regulating how the community manages its resources, though. So is there a second problem to solve here? How do you regulate people outside the community? Do you want to solve that next, or am I missing a piece of how this works?
No, you're asking a great question, and maybe I wasn't clear. These fish traps actually regulate the way people in the community and outside the community deal with the resource, because in fact, those prohibitions are now in place for everybody, not just people in the community, not just people outside the community. The prohibitions that are kind of put in place that are a little bit like management rules, we might call them, those are really important. The prohibitions that are put in place by the spirits, those are important. And people know about them, and I promise you, if you break those rules, something bad is going to happen to you. And so,
People even outside the community?
100%, 100%.
Hello, thank you for this amazing presentation. And as an historic preservationist, I wonder what is the role of architecture in your research, and if there is any exploration of the traditional building culture in the island.
That is, it's like I planted you in the audience. So one of the things that we had a steep learning curve around was marine architecture. How do you build something in the water that people haven't built in 80 years? And that really was Michael Laddie, who's a co-founder of Islands Awareness, and John, talking to people out in the communities who remembered how these fishes looked when they were young, and then looking through the literature and learning from people in Hawaii. There's just an incredible amount of work that's been done on this marine architecture. People in Lavangai Island are, again, unbiased, completely scientific fact here, they're the best architects that there are. So people build these incredible traditional walls for houses that I could talk about all day, but we also have been, because we think with this metaphor of weaving and the walls are actually woven, we've been working with these weavers, master weavers, to think through how to revitalize that architecture. It's not something we have a ton of specialization around. I think one of my dreams is that we would get somebody from Papua New Guinea who wants to go study with Albert Rafidi. You should all Google him. He's an architect. Samoan architect, but he's someone who's really thinking about revitalizing Pacific traditional architecture.
Well, thank you for bringing my topic up, so to speak. I'm interested in the earthquake safety aspects because you do have a lot of big earthquakes there, and there's big knowledge of how to handle that, particularly in New Zealand. And I'm involved with a group that works in places like Bhutan and Nepal that have a similar problem. And architecture is buildings that kill people, not earthquakes. And so these are obviously resilient to a certain extent, but there are ways to extend that. And I don't know, just to throw something out here, in Nepal and Bhutan, there's a school desk that's built so that if the building falls on you, you're fine. If you're under the desk, it's strong enough, and so forth. And it's inexpensive, and again, the group I work with, well, peripherally, I just send them money every now and then, is using the local population and training the local population to handle these tasks of get the desks built, get the buildings checked out, don't build that school building the way you built it when it fell down, we have a new way to do things, and so forth. Do you have any knowledge of where your native knowledge might be applied?
That's a brilliant question. You know, there are people in Port Moresby, the capital city. There are Papua New Guinean architects and people working on the kind of disaster preparedness that this organization that you work with does. I don't work with any of those folks, so I don't really know what they're doing. When we're talking about folks that work in this or that live in this part of the country, it's really kind of local material architecture with people building wooden houses from trees that they harvest themselves. And so earthquake preparedness there is much more focused on what's going to happen to the ocean if there's an earthquake, right? So thinking about tsunamis, and right now thinking about with the erosion that's happened on the beaches, what happens when those out-to-sea earthquakes cause the rising seas. But, you know, I just don't know the folks that are working on that in Port Moresby. Every time I go in, there's one building in Port Moresby, though, that every time I drive by it, I won't go in it. But every time I drive by it, I think, nope, no, 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 no.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I have a question about money, actually, because you started saying how, like, WWF had to comply with certain parameters posed by corporations, like to be able to get the money they needed for their conservation.
So let me interrupt. It's,
okay.
I've never worked with WWF.
Oh, no. My question was more like, it was related to how were you successful in raising funds without having to, you know, have these like parameters that conservation usually gets to get money.
Because we've just had these incredible funders over the years who have taken a chance on us. You know, we said to the program officer at Christensen, when we first met her, Catherine Sparks, we said, we want to do this work that's focused on biocultural diversity, and we want to do it the right way. We want to do it in a way that is not driven by a one-year funding cycle, that's not driven by an external kind of set of parameters to be met. And Catherine, you know, she knew the country, she knows the country really. She no longer works for Christensen. She works for Neoterra, I believe now, if you guys know Neoterra. You know, she said, okay, I'll take a risk on you. And we just have had people that have been willing to do that all along the way. I will say that I have multiple full-time jobs. One of them is being a professor at a university here in New York City. One of them is fundraising and managing the funds for this organization in Papua New Guinea. And so that's the other way that we do it. And this is not to center myself, but I do a lot of fundraising, pretty much fundraise all the time. And so that's the way that we've been able to do it. And again, we've been really lucky. We have an anonymous foundation that funds us right now that really shares a vision with us. And that vision is about reweaving these things that were unwoven by these historical circumstances and really kind of centering the spiritual. Because there's this way in which all of this is revitalizing a real sense that the past and the present and the future, they're all intertwined in these ways that are connected to spirit. We love our funders. If you're watching, we love you.
So I have a question about how, you know, teaching here in the city, and of course being exposed to conservation efforts throughout the world, and no doubt in your teaching, and particularly your experience in Papua New Guinea. Those of us who are involved in conservation in areas where, unfortunately, there really isn't native knowledge that we can actively tap into, or these resources, or have them involved in conservation work that we do. Just, are there insights that you can share about using those, tapping into those who really have only been here, those of us, the white people, have only been here for how long, and there's a lot of sense of entitlement, and the users of I work in coastal conservation. How can we reach hearts and minds there, and how can we utilize, so it's a broad question, how can we utilize those communities and tap into them and just work with what we have?
Mm-hmm. I think that's such a great question. I appreciate it. You know, I grew up in Georgia and kind of split my life as a child between Atlanta, Georgia, and the Cumberland Mountains. And so grew up around an awful lot of people who knew the land really, really, really well. And, you know, it's a settler history. We're Scotch-Irish. I'm Scotch-Irish descent. And so someone who is from another place like that, who's lived in situ for a long time, who's been hunting, who's been fishing, who's been farming, people know the land. And I think that one of the things, I'm going to be careful here, I think one of the things that some parts of the modern environmental movement in the United States have done that has maybe not been super productive is to not think with local people who are actually using biological resources. So if you talk to hunters, hunters know what animals are getting up to. They know what population dynamics look like. They may not be using the language that you would use if you're in the ecology department at Columbia, but they are thinking about population dynamics. If you work on coastal things, if you talk to fishers, you got to get past some sort of an initial skepticism that outsiders are going to be able to do anything for them. But if you look at the work of somebody like Bonnie J. McKay, who is an anthropologist who worked in the United States, she's retired now, she worked in the United States all up and down the East Coast, and she worked on the cod fishery when it collapsed, she worked with oystermen, she's worked in Newfoundland on those fisheries. And again, she just spent years and years and years getting to know these folks, the fisher folks, and getting to understand the complexity of their knowledge. And I just think that's one of the things that maybe needs to not be overlooked no matter what community you're working with, that there is a knowledge base there. I think the question about getting some folks who live close to the land in the United States to think in a more nuanced way about the suite of things that get called climate change is a more complicated question, because I think that that's become so politicized now that it's really hard, except if you sit down and talk to somebody. I have a person in the world I love very, very much who is a hunter who lives in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And if you talk to him about climate change, no way, not talking about that. But if you talk to him about the sort of changing patterns of animals based on the changing forest, if you talk to him about ticks, and there being more ticks now, so I think there are inroads to talking to people, and I think it's complicated.
Can do maybe one more question?
Yes, let's not end on ticks. Ticks are just, that's depressing. I can tell you that there is a leech in Papua New Guinea that is so tiny that you won't see it coming for you, and it actually goes for your iris. No. Yes, isn't that the grossest, most wonderful thing in the world?
Okay, shifting then. This is probably too large a question, but I'm just wondering for you personally, what has it been like? Because you're one slide of having to let it go, I mean.
I feel so lucky every single day, and my husband's in the audience, as I said. He's going to roll his eyes at this because I also complain like everybody else every single day. But I feel so lucky every single day to have been pushed to do a different kind of anthropological research, to have still had the privilege of teaching where I teach, which means that I've been pretty well resourced in terms of having time off to go to Papua New Guinea every year, but also well resourced in terms of having the time to write books and academic papers, and having that intellectual part of my life, and then also being pushed to do this work with communities. So I feel really, really lucky. I sometimes feel really, really frustrated because the need is so great. There's so much happening that communities don't know what to do with. They don't know how to handle it. The changes are happening faster and faster and faster. So I feel frustrated, and there's some days, honestly, that I feel a little bit paralyzed by it all. But then I get a text message, from one of our interns yesterday, or day before yesterday, and he's applying for this really great job after he finishes his internship, and he's going to go on and do great things in the world. And then I had a conversation today in my office with this amazing kid at Columbia who's writing 2 senior thesis projects instead of just 1, and I think, wow, what a life to have had. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Big round of applause, everybody. And keep it going for the Public Lectures Committee that puts us on. Natalie Cash, Paul Tangy, Katie Losi, and Callie Broadus. And thank you to the team that makes these lectures happen. Kevin Murphy, Felix Freeland, and Luis Muga. Thanks so much, everybody.